I'm really excited to have Don and Justin here to introduce their book, A Healthy Nature Handbook. This is their official book launch, exclusive at Wild Things 2021. Don is an independent illustrator, writer, editor in the Chicago region, and Justin is with the Bobolink Foundation, and I'm really excited to hear what they have to say about their book. So take it away.
Great. Just gonna fire up this screen here.
Well, Don does that. Let me just say thanks very much to everyone for tuning in. We couldn't be more excited to share this with you than we are. Thanks also to the conference organizers. We really, really appreciate this opportunity. Wild Things was very much front of mind when we were putting this together, and so we're delighted to share it. Front of mind because we collaborated with about 50 of you on this, but also because you were an audience. The entire community was an audience that we were really hoping that this project would serve. And as Katie said, it's a book launch. You know, the virtual book launches are all the rage these days. But I think that this is the first virtual launch that I've certainly participated in. Our book is not going to be physically available for another couple of months. We're excited that we're working with a publisher to be able to get it out, and probably by June it should be able to be in your hot little hands if you're so interested. But couldn't be more pleased. Thanks for taking the time. We're going to have some time for a Q&A at the end, but we wanted to first talk about what we've done, why we did it, and we'll lead off there just by letting those of you that we don't know a little bit about us. So as Katie said, I'm the Chief Conservation Officer for the Bobolink Foundation. And for about the last 15 years or so, I've been an active participant in volunteer restoration and some bird monitoring in the Chicago area, and mostly at Spring Creek and the greater Barrington area, a proud partner of the Barrington Greenways Initiative. Don, why don't you tell the fine folks about yourself?
Yeah, well, my name is Don Parker. I got my start in volunteer habitat restoration many years ago, actually with Tom Vanderpool and Citizens for Conservation, collecting porcupine grass seed along the right of way. That's where I got my start. I went on to work for Chicago Wilderness Magazine, editing that magazine. Worked for the Forest Preserves of Cook County for several years as a naturalist and in communications. And then in 2004, I co-founded Habitat 2030, which is a group of 20s and 30-somethings trying to connect to habitat restoration in the region. I aged out of that group, unfortunately. I'm actually listed on the schedule as it's still Habitat 2030, but I'm far too old for it now. I joined the Being a Dad group, and now I've been raising my kids and working as a freelancer, and most recently taking care of a local savanna with my hometown conservation commission. So, and of course, working on this book.
Great. So let's move on to the next slide. So, you know, as Don said, he was working on Chicago Wilderness Magazine when I moved up to the greater Chicago area in 2006. This was the issue that was greeting me on my desk. And Don and I got to know one another, and also many of the region's restoration leaders, both through our volunteer work and then our day jobs. I was with Audubon, and the incredible education that we received was rare, unfortunately. We sort of realized, if we can move to the next slide, the best way to learn habitat restoration by far is getting out in the field with someone who's honed their expertise through experimentation and observation. Here, Tom Vanderpool is given a little bit of a lecture on the fine points of savanna restoration to some of the Spring Creek stewards. And this is a sort of an opportunity that was available to Don and to myself through the years. but we recognized that was probably less common than it should be. Flash forward a few years, and Don and I were reconnecting and updating one another after some sort of new chapters in our career, and we decided to update and hike at the same time. So we met at Soame Woods, went for a walk, and as it happens, that walk turned into a conversation about volunteer stewardship. And we were sort of reflecting back on the privileged education that we had had. And we wondered, how is sort of the leading information that is being gleaned by seasoned veterans in the region, how is that being captured? How is that being shared? How are we explaining how to do things, right the first time? And how are we putting out sort of a broad and compelling welcome and really an invitation for innovation from the leaders of tomorrow? And one of us said to the other, what we need is a Cook's Illustrated for restoration. And for anyone that doesn't get that reference, Cook's Illustrated is put out by America's Test Kitchen. It is sort of well-tested recipes that help the home cook elevate their game. There's all sorts of gear reviews and easy how-to technique tutorials.
Yeah, and it goes into depth in a lot of interesting ways with very compelling visuals and hand-drawn things. So this was something that was a bit of a guide star for us. That's what we set out to do. We set out to reach out to stewards with whom we've worked for many, many years, who, over the years have been wonderful sources for us, and stewards who have kind of set themselves apart in the way that they've been able to innovate and the success that they've had in their restorations and the way that they're able to describe what they're doing. We didn't know what this would become at the beginning. We played around with different ideas, videos, magazine, regular kind of recurring blog type of things. But we kind of settled on a book, something tangible, something you could have in your hands that you could, be sharing around a brush pile or something like that. And we decided to start with a prototype chapter. And the first steward that we reached out to was Tom Vanderpool, who has for decades led the restoration efforts with Citizens for Conservation up in the Barrington area. And we wanted to feature a sedge meadow restoration technique that he had been developing. So we went out to CFC headquarters in Barrington, sat down with Tom and also Donna Boltzmann from the CFC, who was extremely supportive of this project. And we talked to him for several hours and went for a walk out in the winter at the time in the savannah and down by the sedge meadow. And one thing that attracted us to Tom in particular was not only his long experience, but also the clear, logical, linear way that he thought about restoration. Some people think in a more circular way, which is great and works for certain things. But in this case, no one made us think more of a repeatable recipe than Tom. And we also understand that you have to, in every restoration, you're kind of adapting and modifying the recipe, so to speak, as you go along. But this gave us a good starting point. And apologies for the pause here. I'm going back and forth between tabs. So we set out to talk to a lot of stewards. We had this good model, and we decided that we kind of take this process to a number of truly amazing people. We went out to Mechusa Grasslands and talked to Jay Stacy, Bernie Buchholz, Cody Considine, Bill Kleiman, Caleb Baker. We talked to Rob Solsky up in Glenview, Tom Vanderpool, of course, Karen Glennemeyer, Jenny Flexman at Schomburg Road Grasslands, Stephen Packard, Linda Masters, and Eriko Kojima from the North Branch Restoration Project. Also, Gary Glowacki from Lake County Forest Preserves, and Allison Sacerdote from Notabart Nature Center. We just gleaned all kinds of information from them. Like I said, we sat down, we interviewed more than 18 stewards and other experts. We recorded every interview, and then we kind of took them home, and we were able to run them over again and again and pull out all the best parts and the tips and techniques, the key findings. And, for us, it was kind of magical to be able to stop time and, you're out in the field with somebody talking and you're like, wait, what was that you said? You want to go back and rewind it and replay it. And this gave us the opportunity to do it. And also just the excuse to be out here and talk to these people and spend time with them. Our hopes for this project, we wanted to capture and share the current state of the art and science of habitat restoration, especially as practiced by volunteers. That was kind of the community that we came up from, and that was an area that we just knew had to be captured. That all of the institutional knowledge and the understanding that people develop over decades, and so much of it was just in their heads, and a lot of it is gets shared through certain through word of mouth and through apprenticeships and volunteers coming out and working with them on work days, but it's not. We felt like there needed to be more different ways to share that information and capture it. And we also wanted to give credit to all of the great leaders, and represent this community as a whole. That said, there are many leaders that we did not get to talk to. This is a subset that we have connections to, and felt really brought out some important points. But there are so many more practitioners, both volunteers and professionals, that are very worthy of this kind of thing too. What we also realized as things went on was that we were going after capturing not just restoration techniques, but documenting a living lineage and being part of making sure that these traditions and understanding kind of gets passed down to the next generation. We needed this book to be a clear invitation to the next generation of leaders. And the urgency for that was really driven home when, as we were finishing up that prototype chapter with Tom, we learned, we were just putting in the last edits, we learned that he had passed away suddenly, and that we really had to regroup there. We had hoped to do more with Tom, but we also knew time just keeps marching on, and to do something like this was important to do now. You may be asking yourselves, why is there a banana on this slide? That is the cover of the Velvet Underground's first album, band from the late 60s. It's very influential in its time. Still a good band. And but there was this perhaps apocryphal quote by Brian Eno, musician and producer, who said that the first album they created only sold 30,000 copies, but everyone that bought it formed the band. And in some way we hope that this gets, this is a pretty focused audience. It's generally Chicago wilderness. It's people who are into restoration. It's a great community. But we kind of hope that a lot of people who get this get excited go off and form their own restoration garage band, so to speak. And the final point on that is just, with almost 500,000 acres of protected natural land in Chicago wilderness, there's kind of no lack of need for detailed attention to the land and that kind of volunteer stewardship. And so we ended up with a book, which we are excited to have learned fairly recently that will be published by Island Press. It consists of 6 chapters. Again, it features these leaders, covers topics from seed distribution to seed production, sedge meadow restoration, monitoring plants, management and monitoring of birds, and also community engagement. Originally, when we thought it might be more regularly recurring, we had, I think we dove into some more esoteric focused topics. And as things evolved, and especially as we lost Tom, we started thinking about how to round out the book more and, emphasize more of the social aspects. And again, that idea of communities and lineages and continuing this work so that it's, over generations, so that it's sustainable and it actually preserves the ecosystems over time. This book wasn't meant to be comprehensive. You can't read just this book alone and expect to know how to do habitat restoration. But taken with the rest of the great resources that are out there, we feel like it captures a lot of important, valuable contributions by stewards, and hopefully adds to the constellation of resources that are out there.
So we're going to dive into some of the pages of the book now, give you a little peek inside. And when we tried to think about how to do this, we decided that rather than sort of going through a chapter, we'd give a smattering of examples from various chapters to give you a little bit broader exposure to some of the content. But maybe by way of orientation, I'd share sort of a flow of how many of the chapters lined out. We weren't quite as formulaic as this slide might suggest. But there were many features that were reoccurring and several that were in each chapter. For instance, every chapter started with an introduction that was really the context setter. We were trying to introduce, the main players and the restoration actions that would be featured there. And then from that, we tended to try to jump into a little bit finer look at either species or maybe trying to interpret some natural history. The real heart of all of these chapters are the sequence, that repeatable restoration recipe that Don had referenced earlier. Each one of those features original art by Bobby Sutton that really brings these cracked codes to life. And we think that that's it's a real highlight of the book as far as I'm concerned. There was a real focus on trying to provide very, very clear and actionable information. And so we did that in both sort of tip sheets and how-tos in various ways. But rather than just giving sort of paint by number in sort of instructions, we also wanted to try to put people inside the minds of some of these really successful restoration practitioners. And we did that in a few different ways, but insight lists are something that we sort of fell back to again and again. We had a couple of reoccurring departments, one that focused on what we thought were underappreciated tools, and others are just highlighting the specific point of craft that may be a way to take a different approach to a familiar restoration activity. And then each chapter had an essay where we were able to unpack some of the insights that the featured leader brought to our conversations and really demystify some of what they had understood in sort of new and helpful ways, I think, for the rest of us. And then every chapter is separated by the next by sort of visual palette cleanser. We really emphasized the use of art throughout, and we are really fortunate that a number of tremendous artists in the area collaborated with us, and so the pages are really vibrant for their creativity. So jumping ahead, here is an example of an introduction, this one obviously from the Nachusa chapter. And in this, and I realize that the type is not going to allow people to read it. So let me tell you, the story that we wanted to tell here was slightly different than the one that you'd read about in the newspapers. Bison and the release of Bison has understandably taken a lot of attention, especially in the media lately. But we really thought that the story was the 30+ years of concerted restoration work done by staff and by volunteer stewards that really exemplify, I think, the region's best example of high quality at scale restorations. And in particular, we wanted to hone in on Nachusa's specific seed genius. And so in the feature, that then follows, we dig into some of those aspects. We talk about Nachusa's approach, how they have gotten the results that they've gotten, but we don't just try to tell you what to do. We try to share the context within which Nachusa takes these approaches. Because, for instance, if you're not seeding into well-prepped soybean stubble, your results may vary. Every place is a little bit different. And so we're trying to give you site-specific details, but not just, but that are applicable, I guess is the way to say that. And so as an example, for years I had known that Bill and others at Nachusa had calculated the optimal seeding rate out there. And I, for the life of me, could never remember whether it was 35 pounds per acre, 45 pounds an acre. I knew that it wasn't pure live seed. They kept some chaff, but this is one example. We've got that. We've enshrined that forever in this book. That it turns out it's 45 pounds per acre that they found was most successful in their soybean seedings, and so that's a great baseline for other projects. For instance, at Spring Creek, we've decided to baseline, use that as a benchmark for the work that we're doing. It turned out we're closer to about 4 pounds an acre. And since we're now interseeding mostly into Eurasian meadows, their goal for this year was to be seeding between 15 and 20 pounds per acre, applying, taking the lesson and what worked well in Nachusa and then applying it in a different context. So we tried to provide enough information that sort of application is available to the reader.
And for what it's worth, I'm glad to be seeing some Velvet Underground lyrics being quoted in the comments. I'm not very good at the multitasking back and forth between the comments and this, but very nice. So here is an example of a sequence, one of the restoration sequences, not restoration, but seed propagation. These were at the heart of each chapter. They were kind of the first thing that we set out to do and became the nucleus for the rest of the chapter that can coalesce around. All 6 sequences were illustrated by Bobby Sutton, who just does fantastic work and really a lot of attention to detail. It's really fun to kind of dive into the middle of all these and see what he's put in there. This one details how Rob Solsky has turned his yard into a factory for rare seed production. You can kind of see not only the layout of his yard, kind of gets you dreaming about your yard or even a smaller space, but you also can follow this through a year in the life of his yard, from putting out seeds in flats and keeping them watered and then forking them out and transplanting them into larger containers and sharing them with restorations and then putting them to bed for the winter. It's a whole process he follows, and we kind of try to pull out a lot of the tips about what he's doing. And again, we can kind of drill down even deeper, and we have a number of how-tos throughout the book, and they just have, they were really fun. We hope they're really fun for people who want to kind of take some action, and we've provided a bunch of ports of entry for people to be like, I would love to do that. How do I even start? And at least we give you kind of the basic information for getting started. May not be, every little detail. We kind of wanted to keep it approachable, not extremely technical, but with enough detail that people kind of see the difference between, sometimes it's just a few different little tweaks and adjustments that a steward's made. That's the difference between, failing and succeeding. And we tried to kind of strike the right balance between that. But mostly, hopefully, everyone, and including beginners, feels empowered by these segments. This was an example of one of our features where we're kind of trying to highlight maybe an underappreciated or unknown aspect of restoration. In this case, we wanted to look at diminutive spring ephemerals for the most part. A lot of them are prairie species here. In a lot of restorations, they're underrepresented in the flora because they hide underneath the thatch, the spring duff, and a lot of them are only a matter of inches tall. They have short blooming periods and even shorter periods when they're setting seed. And a number of them have some pesky habits of flinging their shoot into the prairie when you're not there. And one of Rob's innovations has been to have the plants in his yard where he is all the time, and he can keep them watered. He can be there when they're about to set seed, and we also try to kind of share his insights about tips about when they're going to be ready, like most likely, and the little tells about when their seed is about to be collected. So that's what we do.
I'm going to try to move through these next couple slides pretty quickly so that we save plenty of time for questions and answers. We mentioned that we were trying to give folks insight into the way that stewards thought, and this is probably our most literal example of trying to get into the head of a steward, in this case, Tom. This was just a list of the things that he had in mind around his sedge meadows, how he approaches that work and how those things could go wrong. So an example of being able to put it down in sort of a, easy to refer to list and I think applicable across a number of different projects. This next slide is one of my favorites. This is an example of natural history interpretation, and what we've been told repeatedly through the years, stewards love knowing that monitoring is happening out on their place, but it's not always helpful to receive a long list of species whose habitats you don't know much about, and a long list of species doesn't necessarily help guide management decisions. So what we wanted to do is take a group, in this case, ground nesting grassland birds that sometimes are sort of referred to as one sort of, bulk group, and try to break out with a little bit more nuance the differences in habitat that each of them require. And we did that, both in words and then graphically, in the hopes that this gives a little bit of additional insight to a steward that maybe is more interested in managing a site in a way that would benefit some of these birds, but perhaps more experienced thinking about the plant community.
And most chapters have an essay. These essays are kind of, again, like a drill down in more textual form into the minds of our stewards. And what we did was we compiled a lot of the thoughts and tried to identify different themes that were surfacing and pull them together into coherent and interesting essays that were kind of thematically we wanted to highlight. In this case, this is Dr. Karen Glennemeyer, who we called monitoring midwife, talking about plant monitoring and why we do it, and really thinking hard, like, what questions are you trying to answer, and what is driving the restoration, and hopefully encouraging more stewards to try plant monitoring if they're not doing it.
One of the differentiators in our approach here in this region is the empowerment of volunteer leaders. And we really came to realize what an essential and somewhat overlooked skill that is. So we really wanted to give it some space and build it out here in a way that benefited from some of the experiences of North Branch leaders. So here we talk about the different ways that leaders can be identified, but then also how do you encourage them? It's just an essential skill that we should all be aware of and practice. So those thoughts that we captured were courtesy of Stephen, Linda, and Erico, and here they are, rounding out each of our chapters. We add a little bio of the contributors, and then often have a little artistic interlude. Here we have our toolshed department, as I referenced earlier. This is just giving a little bit of love to an underappreciated piece of restoration equipment, in this case, the scythe.
And then, of course, we would be remiss if we didn't point out the incredible artists that contributed to this book. We really feel like the graphic nature of it sets it apart from a number of other resources. We wanted every page to be a treat to discover, and we really feel like, at least for a lot of people, visual thinkers, being able to visualize these things makes a big difference. But we also wanted this to be a platform not just to clinically analyze technical aspects of restoration, but to celebrate the ecosystems and the wildlife that we're doing this restoration for. And nothing is doing it better than art. So thank you to all of our artists, Carrie Suzanne Carlson in particular, with these very beautiful interludes between each chapter. Philip Juras, amazing oil paintings. Bobby Garrow Sutton, the sequences that we mentioned before. Linda Curtis for her sedges. Kathy Garness for these really fine illustrations of invasive wetland plants. Jenny Vogt, Young Kim, and myself as well. I have to thank myself as often as that is.
I'm seeing in the chats, people are interested to have their own copy. We're delighted to see that, and also delighted to say that Island Press has extended a discount code for Wild Things participants. So the link has been shared in the chat. It's also on the screen now. And you should be able to just search the Island Press website to get it. But just to say, the hard copy will be available, probably shipping early June. I think it's going to be printed in May. We're also doing an ebook that is not yet available for pre-order, but will be available both through Island Press and also Amazon and all that sort of thing. And we wanted to do the ebook for a couple of reasons, but one of which is that we're hopeful that that will translate to more libraries picking it up, and so that this will be able to be, spread widely and hopefully put to good use. So with that, we thought we'd camp on this lovely shot for a second. And Brandon, have you or Katie been tallying questions, or we're turning it over to you to lead the Q&A bit?
Well, Justin, we have one very important question. Where does one get a scythe?
I saw that one. I got mine from Scythe Supply, believe it or not, in Maine. So that is one option. There are different camps. This is what I'd say about a scythe. If you go into Craigslist or something like that, or those sorts of things, you can find them. The ones that you're going to find there are typically the sort of heavier American type scythe, and Scythe Supply and some of the others will provide. They do Austrian scythes. They're much lighter, much I would say sleeker. It's a Ferrari rather than a 4x4. So that'd be my recommendation.
We had another question. People were interested in knowing about some of the raw material of the interviews that you used to assemble the book.
Yeah.
Whether there were any plans for, putting those recordings together into some sort of package or podcast, or making them in some way available.
Define plans. Fanciful daydreams, many. Like Don was saying, initially we thought it might be a podcast. Don, how many hours of recorded interviews do we have?
Oh gosh, I don't know, 10, 15.
Yeah.
More, probably more. I mean,
yeah,
I haven't added it up, but some of the people we've interviewed, we have probably 3, 4, 5 hours.
Yeah, but I love the idea, and I don't think either Don or I have the technical skills to do that, but we have. Not only do we have those recordings, but we have written transcripts for all of them. And so it would be a ton of fun to try to go through and figure out how to slice and dice and make those available for, for everyone.
That said, I think, we'd have to go through a little bit of a process, make sure that, with our stewards and all the sources, because that was, for the most part, we wanted them to feel free to speak, and we just kind of want everything to that it was something that they intended for a public audience. So
yeah, we could cut the incriminating stuff.
It might be a little vetting process. Plus, you have to listen to us. So.
Here's something I'm curious about while we wait for more questions. I'm wondering if there were things that particularly surprised you, that even with both of your sort of background, in ecological restoration, if there were things that, really kind of rose up that you can think of that were surprising or particularly illuminating.
Yeah, lots. I'll just give one example. Literally every conversation was full of revelations, even though these were people that we had lots of conversations with before. But to me, one of the things that was really cool and sort of a magical revelation was when we were talking to Karen Glennemeyer, and she was just in a very, demystifying way, just laying out exactly how one approaches experimental design and how to figure out what it is you want to know and how to design a way to go out and capture that information that is so straightforward that adaptive management is something that is so discussed in conservation circles and so rarely, it's sort of the unicorn of conservation in a lot of ways. It's so rarely practiced. And when you hear Karen describe how straightforward and simple it is, it's sort of hard to explain why it is so rare.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think I don't know if it. I think one of the moments that stands out for me was when we went on the walk with Tom, and we had sandhill cranes coming by, flying by and landing at Flint Creek Savannah, and he was saying that they had stayed there quite a bit longer past their usual November migration, in part because they were getting more sustenance from that sedge meadow now that it was restored, being able to find tubers and things in the ground, whereas they would have had to leave by now if they'd been subsisting on their agricultural field sources and things like that. So I think, and he was talking about also being so excited about seeing the bronze copper butterfly coming back into the restorations, and just listing off all the species that were coming back that they hadn't seen for decades before that. So for me, that was just incredibly affirming. Not totally surprising, but wonderful.
We have another question about how can the info contained in the book be scaled and brought to other regions beyond the Chicago wilderness?
I love that. I'm waiting for someone to answer it. I'm delighted. I mean, the Chicago wilderness community is unlike any other that I know, but it's not completely alone. And we very much thought that the wild ones up in the all around, and the prairie enthusiasts up in the driftless area, and KC Wildlands in the Kansas City area, and others, that there are these groups that we would hope would find value from this as well. Our audience was really this local audience, but we did try to write it in a way that there was applicability to restorations, really, especially throughout the Midwest.
Yeah, I think maybe we hope for copycats. That would be one way it could scale up, is in these other organizations, that there are other people who are trying to capture and share the things that they're learning, and that can be one way organically that it scales up.